I gave away my lunch because he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. I never thought I'd go hungry because of it." Jalen's words hung in the air, raw and filled with a pain that was hard to ignore. It was a cold afternoon in Chicago when 10-year-old Jalen made a choice that would shape his future forever. The park was almost empty, save for the shivering man huddled on the bench with a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry and cold, please help." Jalen had stared at his brown paper lunch bag, the only proper meal he'd have that day. His stomach growled in protest, and yet he couldn't shake the image of the man's trembling hands and hollow eyes. Taking a deep breath, Jalen walked over and handed him the bag. "God bless you," the man whispered, his voice cracking with gratitude. Jalen smiled, trying to ignore the pang of hunger already settling in his stomach. What he didn't realize then was how much that small act of kindness would cost him, and how it would ultimately change his life. What followed wasn't immediate gratitude or recognition. Instead, Jalen found himself the target of ridicule and judgment, his selfless act dismissed and mocked by those who refused to understand. But years later, that single moment of compassion would spark a chain of events so extraordinary that even Jalen couldn't have imagined it. Before we dive deeper into Jalen's journey, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this story from today? Is it a bustling city like Chicago, or a quiet town where everyone knows each other's name? Have you ever seen a moment of kindness, a simple, selfless act, that left you speechless or inspired? Every place has its stories, its struggles, and its heroes. Maybe there's someone in your community who, like Jalen, faced judgment for doing what was right. Or maybe, just maybe, you've been that person. As you watch this story unfold, let it take you to a place where compassion breaks barriers and kindness transforms lives. And when a moment strikes you, when a part of this story tugs at your heart or reminds you of something from your own life, share it with us. Drop a comment below and tell us, what moment moved you? What part touched your soul? If you're inspired by Jalen's journey and want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful stories that touch hearts and bring people together. This isn't just Jalen's journey, it's all of ours. Let's walk through it together. Thank you for watching, and let's dive in. The early morning sun peeked through the gray broken blinds of the tiny apartment, casting uneven shadows across the living room floor. Jalen Gaines, a 10-year-old boy with skin the color of dark mahogany and eyes that burned with quiet determination, carefully adjusted his worn-out backpack. He moved silently, trying not to wake his mother, Clara, who had just returned from her third night shift at the garment factory. Jalen paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the frail figure of his little sister, Lily, curled up on the couch beneath a patchwork quilt. Lily's persistent cough echoed in his memory from the night before. He sighed, gently kissed her forehead, and slipped out of the apartment, the door creaking in protest. It was another chilly morning in Chicago's South Side, a neighborhood known for its resilience as much as its struggles. The streets were alive with the hum of activity. Cars honking, vendors shouting, kids laughing. But Jalen barely noticed. His stomach growled in anticipation as he clutched the small brown paper bag that held his school-provided lunch, the only proper meal he'd get that day. The park was on his way to school, a shortcut he took every day to avoid the busy streets. As he rounded the corner, he froze. Sitting on a splintered bench was an elderly man, his tattered coat barely covering his trembling frame. The man's hands shook as he held a cardboard sign that read in shaky handwriting, "I'm hungry. Please help." Jalen hesitated. He could feel the weight of the lunch in his bag and the sharp pang of hunger gnawing at his insides. It wasn't just a sandwich to him. It was fuel to get through a long day of school, to help him focus while his classmates, with their shiny new lunchboxes, laughed and chatted over their meals. But something about the man on the bench made Jalen stop. His sunken cheeks, the way his eyes darted nervously at passers-by who ignored him, stirred something deep within the boy. Taking a deep breath, Jalen walked up to the man. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Here, you can have this." He held out the lunch bag with both hands, his fingers trembling slightly. The man looked up, his watery blue eyes wide with disbelief. "You sure, kid?" he rasped, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of traffic. Jalen nodded. You need it more than I do." The man reached out with shaking hands, his fingers brushing against the boy's. "God bless you," he whispered, his voice breaking as tears filled his eyes. Jalen watched as the man opened the bag, his face lighting up at the sight of the simple peanut butter sandwich, the small carton of milk, and the apple. It wasn't much, but to the man, it might as well have been a feast. Jalen felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, a feeling that momentarily eclipsed the hunger he knew would follow. As he turned to leave, a deep voice called out from behind him. "Hey kid, wait up." Jalen spun around to see a tall, well-dressed man walking toward him, his leather shoes clicking against the pavement. His presence was commanding, his tailored suit out of place in the worn-down park. "That's my father," the man said, gesturing to the elderly man on the bench. "Did you just give him your lunch?" Jalen nodded hesitantly, unsure of what to expect. The man crouched slightly to meet his gaze, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That was incredibly kind of you," he said, his tone sincere. "Not many people would have done that." The man extended his hand. "I'm Henry. What's your name?" "Jalen," the boy replied, shaking the man's firm grip. "Well, Jalen, I'd like to thank you properly. Do you have a little time before school?" Henry asked. Jalen hesitated, glancing toward the park's edge where the path to his school began. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Be careful who you trust." But something about Henry's earnest expression and the kindness in his eyes made Jalen nod. "Great," Henry said, standing up straight. "Come with me. I think there's someone you need to meet." This artisan bakery echoed in Jalen's ears as he stepped inside for his first day. His wide eyes darted around, taking in the polished marble countertops, the gleaming glass displays filled with intricately decorated pastries, and the hum of morning customers sipping lattes at small wooden tables. The scent of fresh bread and warm vanilla filled the air, intoxicating and comforting. For a moment, he felt like he'd walked into another world, a world far removed from the cramped, dimly lit apartment he called home. "Jalen," Henry's voice broke through the boy's thoughts. The tall man stood beside him, his presence as commanding as ever. "This place," Henry said, gesturing at the bustling bakery, "is where dreams can start, but it's also where hard work is everything. You ready?" Jalen nodded, clutching the straps of his backpack tighter. "Yes, sir." Henry smiled. "Good. Follow me." Henry led Jalen through the bustling kitchen, a maze of stainless steel counters, roaring ovens, and chefs in crisp white coats shouting orders. The workers barely glanced at Jalen, too absorbed in the rhythm of kneading, whisking, and assembling delicate desserts. "This is where the magic happens," Henry explained as he showed Jalen the different stations, the dough mixers, the pastry stations, the ovens. Jalen soaked in every detail, his heart racing with excitement. But his enthusiasm quickly dimmed when Henry introduced him to the staff. "Everyone, this is Jalen," Henry announced to the team gathered in the kitchen. "He'll be helping out around the bakery, show him the ropes." A moment of silence hung in the air before a tall, stern-looking man with graying hair stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker," the man said, his tone measured but cold. "You're saying this kid is going to work here?" "Yes, Marcus," Henry replied firmly. "I trust you'll guide him well." Marcus's lips tightened into a thin line. "Of course." Jalen felt the weight of the man's scrutinizing gaze. He couldn't miss the murmurs that rippled through the room, or the skeptical glances from the other workers. His excitement faltered, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. The first few days were harder than Jalen anticipated. His tasks were menial, sweeping floors, washing dishes, and organizing supplies, but the sheer pace of the bakery left him breathless. Every mistake, no matter how small, seemed to draw disapproving stares or whispered comments from the staff. Marcus, who was second in command after Henry, seemed particularly harsh. "You call this clean?" he barked one morning, pointing at a counter Jalen had just wiped down. "Do it again, and do it right." "Yes, sir," Jalen replied quietly, biting back the frustration that bubbled inside him. He worked harder, longer, trying to prove himself, but it felt like he was swimming against a tide of doubt. Despite the hostility, Jalen found moments of solace. He watched in awe as the chefs worked, their hands moving with precision and artistry. Late at night, when the bakery was quiet, Jalen would practice on scraps of dough left over from the day. His fingers fumbled at first, but slowly he began to shape simple rolls and twists, his confidence growing with each attempt. One evening, as Jalen was finishing his cleaning duties, he overheard Marcus talking to another employee near the ovens. "I don't know what Henry's thinking," Marcus muttered, his voice low but sharp. "This kid doesn't belong here. He's not one of us." Jalen's heart sank. The words hit harder than he expected, leaving a sting of humiliation and anger. He wanted to storm out, to quit, and never come back. But he thought of Henry's faith in him. He thought of his mother's sacrifices and the dream he carried in his heart. The next day, Jalen arrived at the bakery an hour early. As the staff trickled in, they found him kneeling by the ovens, scrubbing every inch until the metal gleamed. He didn't say a word, but his actions spoke volumes. Gradually, a few staff members began to notice his determination. One of the younger pastry chefs, a woman named Elena, even started offering him tips. "Here," she said one afternoon, handing him a piping bag. "Try this. It's not as easy as it looks, but you'll get the hang of it." Jalen smiled gratefully, his spirits lifting. For the first time since he'd started, he felt a small crack in the wall of hostility around him. But not everyone was willing to give him a chance. Marcus and a few others grew increasingly irritated by Jalen's presence. They saw his growing confidence as a threat, and one morning, their frustration boiled over. It was a busy Saturday, the bakery packed with customers. Jalen had been tasked with carrying trays of pastries to the front display. As he carefully placed a tray of delicate macarons on the counter, Marcus called out sharply, "Jalen, the back kitchen needs you, now." "Yes, sir." Jalen hurried toward the kitchen, leaving the display unattended for just a moment. When he returned, the tray of macarons was gone. Marcus stood by the empty counter, his arms crossed and a smug look on his face. "Where are the macarons?" Marcus demanded loudly, drawing the attention of everyone in the bakery. I don't know," Jalen stammered, panic rising in his chest. "They were your responsibility," Marcus snapped, "and now they're gone. This is unacceptable." The customers murmured, their curious gazes burning into Jalen. His cheeks flushed with shame as he struggled to find the words to defend himself. But before he could speak, Henry appeared. "What's going on here?" Henry asked, his voice calm but authoritative. "Jalen neglected his duties," Marcus said smoothly. "It's clear he's not cut out for this." Henry frowned, glancing between Marcus and Jalen. "Is that true, Jalen?" Jalen opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain when he didn't even know what had happened? He lowered his head, his silence speaking for him. The tension in the room was palpable as Henry's gaze lingered on Jalen. "We'll discuss this later," he said finally, his tone heavy with disappointment. "For now, Marcus, handle the display." Jalen felt the weight of the bakery's judgment as he retreated to the kitchen. His mind raced, replaying the scene over and over. Had he really failed, or was something more sinister at play? He didn't know, but one thing was certain. This was far from over. Jalen's hands trembled as he scrubbed the kitchen counters for what felt like the 100th time that day. The whispers and side glances from the other staff were like needles piercing his resolve. Marcus's accusations had left him humiliated, and Henry's disappointed tone echoed in his mind. Every movement felt heavier, as though the weight of the entire bakery rested on his shoulders. When the day finally ended, Jalen lingered in the empty kitchen, staring at his reflection in the polished steel of the ovens. He clenched his fists. "This isn't fair," he thought. "I didn't do anything wrong." But he also knew the world had never been fair to someone like him. He was a poor black kid in a prestigious bakery where perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded, and now he was teetering on the edge of failure. The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts. Jalen turned to see Elena, the young pastry chef, who had occasionally shown him kindness, standing in the doorway. In her hands, she held a small plate of leftovers from the day's baking, a slice of rich chocolate cake and a delicate cream puff. "I thought you might need this," she said softly, setting the plate down on the counter. "Rough day, huh?" Jalen nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I didn't mess up," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I swear I didn't." Elena hesitated, then pulled out a stool and sat across from him. "I believe you," she said, "and I've worked here long enough to know that sometimes Marcus doesn't play fair." Jalen's eyes widened. "You think he—" "I don't know," Elena interrupted, holding up a hand. "But I've seen him pull stunts before to make new hires quit. He doesn't like anyone upsetting the balance around here, especially not someone who doesn't fit his idea of who should work in a place like this. Her words stung, but they also lit a spark of determination in Jalen. He wasn't going to let Marcus or anyone else push him out. "What should I do?" he asked, his voice firmer now. Elena smiled faintly. "Keep working. Keep proving them wrong. Henry's a good man. He'll see the truth eventually." The next morning, Jalen arrived early, as usual. But this time, instead of heading straight to his cleaning duties, he decided to investigate. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the missing macarons. He started in the back kitchen, checking every shelf and storage area. Finally, in a corner near the trash bins, he found it, a crumpled tray with a few smashed macarons still clinging to its surface. His heart pounded as he picked it up. Who would do this? Before he could think further, the door swung open and Marcus stepped in. His eyes landed on the tray in Jalen's hands, and for a split second, his expression wavered. Then he sneered. "What are you doing back here?" Jalen stood his ground. "I found this," he said, holding up the tray. "The macarons didn't just disappear. Someone dumped them." Marcus's face darkened. "That doesn't prove anything." But before Marcus could say more, a voice interrupted. "It proves plenty." Henry stepped into the room, his gaze sharp as he took in the scene. He'd overheard everything. "Marcus, care to explain why those macarons ended up in the trash?" For a moment, Marcus faltered. Then he straightened, his tone defensive. I didn't see who did it. Maybe it was him." He pointed at Jalen. Henry crossed his arms. "You're accusing Jalen without any proof, and yet this tray conveniently ends up hidden in the back. I think it's time we had a serious talk." Later that day, Henry called a meeting in the kitchen. The staff gathered, their curiosity and tension palpable. Jalen stood quietly at the edge of the room, his heart pounding as Henry addressed the team. "It has come to my attention that someone in this bakery has been sabotaging the work of others," Henry began, his tone calm but firm. "That ends now. This bakery is built on trust and excellence, and I won't tolerate anyone undermining those values." He turned to Jalen, his expression softening. "Jalen, you've had a rough start here, and for that, I owe you an apology. I should have trusted you more. But from now on, I want you to know, you belong here." The room was silent, but Jalen could feel the shift in the air. Marcus avoided his gaze, his jaw tight. Elena gave Jalen a small nod of encouragement, and for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could make it in this world. With Marcus demoted and placed under scrutiny, Jalen's days at the bakery became a little easier. The whispers and side glances didn't disappear overnight, but he noticed a change in how some of the staff treated him. A few even started asking for his help, or inviting him to join their conversations during breaks. But Jalen didn't let the newfound acceptance distract him from his goal. Late at night, when the bakery was quiet, he stayed behind to practice. With Elena's guidance, he began to master the basics of pastry making, his clumsy attempts gradually transforming into something closer to art. One evening, as Jalen carefully piped cream onto a choux pastry, Henry walked in. He watched silently for a moment before speaking. "You've got talent, kid," he said, his voice warm. "And you've got heart. Those two things will take you far." Jalen looked up, his face breaking into a rare smile. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down," Henry chuckled. "I know you won't." As Jalen packed up for the night, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass display case. For the first time, he saw more than just a poor boy from the South Side. He saw a young man with a future he was determined to claim, no matter what challenges lay ahead. But as he flipped off the lights and stepped out into the chilly Chicago night, he couldn't shake the feeling that his journey was just beginning, and that the road ahead would be anything but smooth. Jalen's hands moved with precision as he carefully arranged the final touches on his display. A delicate tower of eclairs, each topped with a perfectly glossy layer of chocolate ganache. The competition hall buzzed with excitement, the air thick with the sweet aroma of sugar and ambition. This wasn't just another contest for Jalen, it was his chance to prove he belonged. The judges circled the room, murmuring among themselves, their expressions inscrutable as they stopped to inspect each creation. He glanced at Henry, who stood a few feet away, watching with quiet pride. Henry had been his rock through everything, his unwavering belief pushing Jalen to reach further than he ever thought possible. Winning this competition would solidify Jalen's reputation and honor the faith Henry had placed in him. But as the judges moved closer to his station, a cold voice pierced through the buzz of the room. Well, well, if it isn't the charity case. Jalen's stomach clenched. He turned to see Richard Dawson, a towering figure in the culinary world and the very definition of privilege. Richard's perfectly tailored chef's coat and condescending smirk screamed superiority. He was a celebrated pastry chef, his name synonymous with high-end cuisine, and someone who viewed Jalen not as competition, but as an anomaly. Still playing dress-up in the kitchen, I see, Richard said, his words dripping with mockery. It's cute, really, but let's be honest, this isn't exactly your arena. Jalen clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He wanted to fire back, to tell Richard that his work spoke for itself, but the weight of the room's attention bore down on him. He couldn't let Richard's words distract him now. Not here. Good luck, Dawson, Jalen said evenly, turning back to his display. He refused to give Richard the satisfaction of a reaction, but Richard wasn't done. Luck won't help when you're in over your head, he sneered before walking away. The judges finally arrived at Jalen's table. They examined his creation closely, their expressions unreadable as they took notes and whispered amongst themselves. Jalen held his breath, every muscle in his body taut as he awaited their verdict. When they moved on to the next station without a word, his heart sank. Had he done enough? Was his work even worthy of their consideration? As the competition drew to a close, the room fell silent, the anticipation almost unbearable. The head judge stepped forward, holding an envelope that contained the winner's name. Jalen's heart pounded in his chest as the judge's voice rang out. And the winner of this year's competition is Jalen Gaines. For a moment, Jalen didn't move. The words felt surreal, as though they belonged to someone else. But as the crowd erupted in applause, the reality of his victory washed over him. He had done it. Against all odds, he had won. Jalen stepped forward to accept his award, his hands trembling as he held the trophy. The judges congratulated him, their praise genuine and warm. But as he scanned the crowd, his eyes landed on Richard, standing at the back of the room with a sour expression. The bitterness in Richard's gaze was unmistakable. The victory was sweet, but Jalen knew it wasn't the end. If anything, it was just the beginning of a new battle. The fallout from the competition was immediate. Articles and interviews praised Jalen's talent, dubbing him a rising star in the pastry world. Customers flocked to Henry's bakery, eager to taste the creations of the young chef who had defied expectations. But with the praise came whispers, rumors that Jalen hadn't earned his success. It didn't take long to trace the source of the rumors back to Richard. In an interview with a prominent culinary magazine, Richard had all but accused Jalen of cutting corners to win. He hinted that Jalen's connection to Henry, a respected figure in the industry, had unfairly influenced the judges. I'm not saying the kid doesn't have potential, Richard had said with a smirk. But let's be real, talent only gets you so far without certain advantages. The words stung, but Jalen refused to let them derail him. Instead, he threw himself into his work, determined to let his creations speak for themselves. But the rumors persisted, casting a shadow over his growing reputation. Customers began to question whether Jalen's success was genuine or the result of favoritism. One evening, as Jalen worked late in the bakery, Henry approached him. "You've seen the articles, haven't you?" he asked gently. Jalen nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know how to fight this, Henry. No matter what I do, it feels like it's never enough." Henry placed a hand on Jalen's shoulder. "You don't fight it with words, Jalen. You fight it with action. Let them doubt you. Let them talk. And then show them why they're wrong." The opportunity to do just that came sooner than Jalen expected. A high-profile charity event in Chicago was hosting a live baking competition, and Jalen was invited to participate. The stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about winning a trophy. It was about proving once and for all that his talent was real. The event drew some of the biggest names in the industry, including Richard Dawson. Jalen knew the pressure would be immense, but he also knew this was his chance to silence the doubters. The competition was grueling, the time constraints forcing the chefs to work under intense pressure. Jalen focused on creating a dessert that not only showcased his technical skills, but also told a story, a tribute to his roots and the people who had believed in him. As the timer counted down, Jalen's hands moved with purpose, his mind blocking out everything except the task at hand. He plated his final creation with seconds to spare, stepping back to survey his work. It was a masterpiece, a chocolate tart layered with flavors that represented his journey, rich cocoa, vibrant citrus, and a touch of heat from a spiced caramel glaze. When the judges tasted his dessert, their reactions were immediate. Eyes widened, heads nodded, and murmurs of approval filled the room. But Jalen didn't dare let himself hope until the final results were announced. First place goes to Jalen Gaines. The applause was deafening, but it was the silence from Richard that spoke the loudest. For the first time, Jalen saw a flicker of something in Richard's eyes. Not anger, but respect. As Jalen accepted his award, he felt a sense of vindication. The rumors would fade, and the doubts would disappear. Because in that moment, he had proven not just to the world, but to himself, that he belonged. And as he looked out at the crowd, he saw Henry smiling proudly, a reminder of how far he'd come, and how much further he could go. Jalen stood at the counter of his newly opened bakery, the warm scent of freshly baked bread mingling with the faint aroma of coffee. The soft glow of the morning sun illuminated the cozy space, highlighting the care he had put into every detail. The carefully chosen rustic furniture, the neatly arranged displays of pastries, and the handwritten chalkboard menu. It was his dream come to life, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was standing on solid ground. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. The bakery was quiet, too quiet. The rush of customers he'd anticipated hadn't materialized, and the bills were piling up. Rent, utilities, and payroll loomed like dark clouds on the horizon. Every day he opened the doors, hoping for a miracle, but the steady flow of foot traffic he needed never came. His savings, painstakingly built over years of hard work, were dwindling faster than he could replenish them. One evening, after closing the bakery, Jalen slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. Henry walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of Jalen and sat across from him. "You've been quiet," Henry said, his voice calm but probing. Jalen sighed, lifting his head. "I don't know if I can do this, Henry. I thought if I just worked hard enough, everything would fall into place. But it feels like I'm fighting a losing battle." Henry leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "No one said it would be easy, Jalen. Starting something new, especially in this business, is a marathon, not a sprint." "But what if I can't make it?" Jalen's voice cracked, betraying the vulnerability he'd been holding back. "What if I've just been fooling myself this whole time?" Henry leaned forward, his expression firm but kind. "Listen to me. Failure isn't the end, Jalen. It's part of the process. Every great chef, every successful entrepreneur has faced setbacks. What matters is what you do next." Jalen nodded, though the weight in his chest didn't lift. He wanted to believe Henry's words, but the reality of his situation felt overwhelming. That night, Jalen returned home to find his mother, Clara, waiting for him in the small living room of their apartment. She was folding laundry, her movements slow and deliberate. The lines on her face seemed deeper than he remembered, her exhaustion etched into every feature. "How's the bakery?" she asked, not looking up. Jalen hesitated, then sat down across from her. "It's fine," he lied, though he knew she could hear the strain in his voice. Clara set down the laundry and met his eyes. "Jalen, you don't have to pretend with me. I know things have been hard." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't want to let you down, Mom. You've sacrificed so much, and I thought this was my way of giving back. But now, I'm not sure I can even keep it afloat." Clara reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You've already given me more than I could have ever asked for. You've worked hard, you've followed your dreams, and you've shown Lily that anything is possible. That's more than enough." Her words were comforting, but they didn't erase the guilt gnawing at him. He thought of Lily, now a bright and curious teenager, looking up to him as her role model. He couldn't bear the thought of failing her, or his mother. The next few weeks brought more challenges. A faulty oven set them back hundreds of dollars in repairs, and a string of rainy days kept customers away. Jalen worked tirelessly, often sleeping on a cot in the back of the bakery to save time and money. He experimented with new recipes, hoping to attract a broader audience, but the results were mixed. One day, as he was reviewing the bakery's accounts, the phone rang. He answered, his heart sinking as he recognized the voice on the other end. It was the landlord. The rent was overdue, and the man's tone left no room for negotiation. "You've got 2 weeks to pay, Gaines," the landlord said curtly. "No more extensions." Jalen hung up, his hands shaking. 2 weeks. He had 2 weeks to come up with the money or risk losing everything he'd worked for. He spent that night going over every possible solution, but no matter how he crunched the numbers, the outcome was the same. He was out of time and options. The next morning, he called Henry and told him everything. "I don't know what to do, Henry," Jalen admitted, his voice heavy with defeat. "I feel like I'm drowning." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Henry spoke. "Come to the bakery tomorrow morning. We'll figure it out together." When Jalen arrived at Henry's bakery the next day, he was surprised to see a small group of people gathered, familiar faces, friends he'd made over the years, and even a few loyal customers. Henry stepped forward, a warm smile on his face. "We've got your back, Jalen," Henry said. "This bakery means too much to let it fail. Let's get to work." Over the next few days, the group helped Jalen organize a fundraiser at the bakery. They spread the word through social media, handing out flyers and sharing stories about Jalen's journey. The event drew a crowd, the bakery bustling with life in a way Jalen hadn't seen in weeks. Customers lined up to support him, purchasing pastries and donating generously. By the end of the night, Jalen had raised enough to cover the rent and buy himself some time. As he locked up the bakery, a wave of relief washed over him, though he knew the road ahead would still be difficult. He glanced at Henry, who stood beside him. "Thank you," Jalen said, his voice filled with gratitude. Henry clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this, kid. Remember that." Jalen nodded, a small spark of hope reigniting within him. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a fighting chance. The relief from the fundraiser was short-lived. While the funds had bought Jalen some time, it wasn't enough to address the deeper issues plaguing the bakery. Competition in the area was fierce, and his loyal customers, though supportive, couldn't sustain the business alone. The days began to blend together as Jalen juggled marketing, accounting, baking, and cleaning. Exhaustion hung over him like a storm cloud, but he refused to let it break him. One evening, as Jalen was closing the bakery, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara. "Come home soon, it's Lily." His chest tightened. Clara wasn't one to overreact, so if she was reaching out, it had to be serious. He locked up the bakery in a hurry and rushed to their apartment. When he arrived, he found Lily curled up on the couch, her face pale and her breathing labored. Clara hovered nearby, her worry etched deeply into her features. "She's been like this all day," Clara explained, her voice tight with fear. "I tried to call the clinic, but they said we need to take her to the ER." Jalen didn't hesitate. He scooped Lily into his arms and carried her to the car. The drive to the hospital was a blur, Clara's murmured prayers filling the silence as Jalen gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Hours later, they sat in a sterile hospital room, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over everything. A doctor entered, his expression calm but serious. "Lily has a respiratory infection," he explained. "It's treatable, but she'll need medication and some follow-up care." Relief flooded through Jalen, but it was quickly replaced by dread when the doctor handed them the bill. The amount was staggering, far beyond what Jalen could afford, even with the money left from the fundraiser. Clara's face fell as she scanned the paper, her hands trembling. "We'll figure it out," Jalen said firmly, though he had no idea how. He couldn't bear to see his sister suffer, and he refused to let Clara carry the burden alone. As they left the hospital, Lily sleeping soundly in Clara's arms, Jalen's mind raced. He had spent years working toward his dream, but now it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. The bakery was struggling, his family was in crisis, and the weight of it all threatened to crush him. The next morning, Jalen sat in the bakery, staring at the rows of empty tables. The once inviting space now felt like a monument to his failure. He thought of the sacrifices Clara had made, the nights she spent sewing clothes until her fingers bled, all to give him and Lily a chance at a better life. He thought of Henry's unwavering support, the belief that had carried him this far. And he thought of Lily, whose bright smile had always been a source of light in his darkest moments. He couldn't give up, not now. Determined, Jalen began brainstorming ways to bring in more customers. He reached out to local businesses, offering to cater their events. He connected with food bloggers and influencers, inviting them to try his pastries in exchange for reviews. Slowly, the efforts began to pay off. The bakery saw a slight uptick in sales, enough to keep the lights on and cover Lily's medication. But it wasn't enough to pull him out of the hole entirely. One afternoon, as Jalen worked on a new recipe, Henry walked in, a newspaper tucked under his arm. He placed it on the counter, his expression unreadable. "Take a look," Henry said. Jalen picked up the paper and froze. On the front page was an announcement for a regional pastry competition, the prize a substantial cash reward. It was the kind of opportunity that could change everything for the bakery and for his family. "You've got the talent," Henry said, his voice steady. "And you've got the heart. This could be your chance." Jalen stared at the paper, doubt creeping in. The competition would be fierce, and the thought of facing seasoned professionals again was daunting. But the memory of Lily in the hospital, of Clara's tired eyes, fueled his resolve. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm. The weeks leading up to the competition were grueling. Jalen spent every spare moment perfecting his recipe, a dessert that combined elements of his past and his aspirations. A spiced apple tart with a caramel glaze, inspired by the simple flavors he grew up with, elevated by the techniques he'd learned over the years. Henry and Elena, who had become one of his closest allies, offered guidance and encouragement, their support a lifeline in his moments of doubt. On the day of the competition, Jalen arrived early, his nerves jangling. The venue was bustling with activity, the air thick with the scent of sugar and butter. He set up his station, his hands steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. As the competition began, Jalen lost himself in the process. His movements were deliberate, each step a testament to the countless hours of practice. When he placed the finished tart in front of the judges, he felt a surge of pride. Win or lose, he had poured his heart into this creation. The announcement of the winners felt like an eternity. Jalen stood among the other contestants, his heart pounding as the head judge stepped forward. "And the grand prize goes to Jalen Gaines." The room erupted in applause, but Jalen barely heard it. The weight that had pressed on him for months seemed to lift in an instant. He had done it, not just for himself, but for his family, for Henry, for everyone who had believed in him. As he accepted the trophy, Jalen looked out at the crowd and saw Clara and Lily standing in the back, their faces glowing with pride. Tears blurred his vision as he raised the trophy high, the moment a culmination of every struggle, every sacrifice. That evening, as they celebrated at the bakery, Jalen pulled Clara aside. "This is for you," he said, handing her an envelope containing a portion of the prize money. "For everything you've done for me and Lily." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I don't need this, Jalen. Seeing you succeed, seeing you happy, that's more than enough." "But it's not enough for me," Jalen replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me everything, Mom. Now it's my turn." They embraced, the weight of the past few months melting away. In that moment, Jalen knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he had the strength to face them. Because he wasn't doing it alone. The small hand-painted sign on the window of Jalen's bakery read, "Closed until further notice." It was a lie, one Jalen had written himself, the words heavy with shame. The truth was far worse. The bakery wasn't temporarily closed. It was gone, shuttered. The dream he'd spent years building had crumbled faster than he ever thought possible. Jalen stood in the empty space that had once buzzed with life. The shelves were bare, the smell of fresh bread and pastries replaced by the cold, metallic scent of failure. His reflection in the darkened glass of the display case stared back at him, a haunting reminder of everything he'd lost. He clenched his fists, the memory of signing the bankruptcy papers still fresh in his mind. It had started small, a dip in sales, a couple of slow months that he thought he could weather. But as the weeks turned into months, the financial strain grew unbearable. Repairs to the aging ovens ate through his savings. A failed catering deal left him scrambling to recover costs. And the relentless competition in the neighborhood chipped away at his already fragile customer base. Jalen had tried everything. Late-night brainstorming sessions, new recipes, marketing campaigns. But nothing worked. Each attempt felt like throwing water on a wildfire, the flames consuming his efforts faster than he could douse them. He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when he realized he was out of options. but the weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders. Sometimes, hard work isn't enough, he muttered bitterly to himself, his voice echoing in the empty room. The hardest part wasn't the loss itself. It was facing the people who believed in him, his family, his friends, and, most painfully, Henry. Jalen had avoided seeing him since the closure, unable to bear the disappointment he was sure would be etched on Henry's face, but he couldn't avoid him forever. One rainy afternoon, Jalen found himself standing outside Henry's bakery, his nerves frayed. He hesitated, staring at the familiar door as customers came and went, their umbrellas dripping onto the sidewalk. Finally, he pushed it open, the warm smell of pastries enveloping him in a bittersweet wave of nostalgia. Henry spotted him immediately. "Jalen," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and concern. "It's been a while." Jalen forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, sorry about that. I've just been busy." Henry gestured for him to sit at a corner table. "I've been hearing things," he said carefully once they were seated, "about your bakery." Jalen's throat tightened. "It's gone," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't keep it running." Henry leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I see. And you didn't think to tell me?" Jalen looked down at his hands, unable to meet Henry's gaze. "What would I have said? That I failed? That I let everyone down?" Henry sighed, his tone softening. "Failure isn't something to be ashamed of, Jalen. It's a part of the journey. But shutting people out, that's a mistake." Jalen's head shot up, a spark of frustration flaring. "You make it sound so easy, like I'm supposed to just pick myself up and keep going. Do you know how humiliating it is to lose everything? To watch something you built with your own hands fall apart?" "I do," Henry said simply, his calm tone cutting through Jalen's anger. "I've been there." The words stopped Jalen in his tracks. He stared at Henry, confusion flickering across his face. "This bakery isn't my first," Henry continued. "The first one failed after a year. The second barely lasted 6 months. But I learned from every mistake, and that's why I'm still standing here." Jalen didn't know what to say. He'd always seen Henry as unshakable, someone who never faltered. To hear that he'd faced similar struggles was both humbling and strangely comforting. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Jalen asked. Henry smiled faintly. "Because it wasn't about me. It was about you. And I knew you'd need to face your own challenges. What matters now is what you do next." That night, Jalen sat in his apartment, Henry's words ringing in his ears. He wanted to believe he could start over, but the fear of failing again loomed large. He thought of Clara, who had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He thought of Lily, who looked up to him as an example of resilience. And he thought of the people who had supported him through his journey, their faith, a reminder of what he'd already overcome. But the question lingered, was he ready to try again? The answer came in the form of a late-night text from Elena, his friend and former colleague. "I heard about the bakery. I'm so sorry, Jalen. If you ever need someone to talk to or help you figure out your next move, I'm here." Jalen stared at the message for a long time before typing his response. "Thanks, Elena. I think I'll take you up on that." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jalen met with Elena the following evening at a quiet cafe tucked away in a less bustling part of the city. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and faint vanilla, a soothing contrast to the turmoil in his mind. Elena greeted him with her usual warmth, her smile genuine despite the heaviness of the situation. "I was so sorry to hear about the bakery," she said after they ordered. "I know how much it meant to you." Jalen nodded, his hands wrapped tightly around his coffee cup. "It wasn't just about me," he admitted. "It was for my mom, for Lily, for everyone who believed in me. I wanted to show them that all their sacrifices weren't in vain." Elena leaned forward, her expression earnest. "You didn't fail them, Jalen. You worked hard, and sometimes things don't go the way we plan. That doesn't erase everything you accomplished." Her words were kind, but Jalen couldn't shake the weight of his guilt. "It's not just about losing the bakery," he said. "It's about feeling like I let everyone down, especially Henry. He gave me so much, and I feel like I've wasted it." Elena reached across the table, resting a hand on his. "Henry believes in you, Jalen. He always has. And he's right. You're not done yet." Jalen wanted to believe her, but the fear of trying again and failing again was suffocating. "What if I'm just not cut out for this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Then you'll find out by trying," Elena said firmly. "But I don't think that's the case. I think you've got what it takes, and I'm not the only one who sees it." Her confidence in him was a balm for his battered spirit. For the first time in weeks, Jalen felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't finished after all. Over the next few days, Jalen began to take small steps forward. He revisited old recipes, tweaking and refining them with a renewed sense of purpose. He reached out to former customers and colleagues, asking for feedback and advice. Each conversation was a reminder of the connections he'd built, the community that had supported him through every high and low. But the shadow of his failure still loomed, and it wasn't long before it collided with his relationship with Henry. It started with a casual conversation at Henry's bakery, where Jalen had been spending more time lately, helping out and seeking guidance. Henry had noticed Jalen's growing determination and suggested a new venture, a collaboration between their bakeries to create a unique line of pastries. At first, the idea thrilled Jalen. It felt like a fresh start, a way to rebuild while leaning on the foundation Henry had created. But as they began to discuss the details, disagreements surfaced. "I think we should focus on more modern flavors," Jalen said one afternoon as they worked on a batch of test recipes. "Things that appeal to a younger audience, fusion desserts, maybe even gluten-free options." Henry frowned, wiping his hands on a towel. "There's nothing wrong with sticking to the classics. They've worked for decades, and they'll keep working if we do them right." Jalen hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I get that, Henry, but times are changing. If we don't adapt, we're going to fall behind." Henry's expression hardened. "Or we could stay true to what we know works." "You're talking about chasing trends, Jalen, and that's a dangerous game." The tension between them simmered over the next few weeks, their once easy rapport strained by their conflicting visions. For Jalen, the stakes felt impossibly high. This was his chance to prove himself, to show that he could rise from the ashes of his failure. But, for Henry, it was a matter of protecting the legacy he'd spent decades building. The breaking point came during a meeting to finalize their plans. Jalen presented a proposal for a new menu, complete with modern designs and marketing strategies aimed at younger customers. Henry listened in silence, his face unreadable, until Jalen finished. "This isn't what we do," Henry said finally, his voice low but firm. "You're trying to turn this into something it's not." Jalen's frustration boiled over. "What's the point of working so hard if we're just going to stay stuck in the past? Don't you want this to grow, to reach more people?" Henry's eyes flashed with anger. "I want it to succeed, Jalen, and that means knowing when to hold your ground. You're so focused on changing everything that you're losing sight of what matters." "And what matters is what you want, right?" Jalen shot back, his voice rising. "Not what's best for the business, not what might actually work, just what you're comfortable with." The room fell silent, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Henry's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Jalen thought he might yell. But when Henry finally spoke, his tone was quiet and cold. "If that's how you feel, maybe this isn't the right partnership after all." The words hit Jalen like a blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Instead, he turned and walked out of the bakery, the door slamming shut behind him. The sound of the bakery door slamming behind him echoed in Jalen's mind long after he left. He walked aimlessly through the streets of Chicago, the cool evening air biting against his skin. The anger he'd felt during his argument with Henry was now replaced by something heavier: regret. Henry had been more than a mentor. He had been a father figure, someone who believed in Jalen when no one else did. But in that moment, the weight of his own pride and frustration had eclipsed everything else. Jalen found himself at a small park, the same one where, years ago, he'd given his lunch to a hungry stranger. He sat down on a familiar bench, staring at the empty swings swaying gently in the breeze. His mind raced with thoughts of the past few weeks, his bakery's closure, the financial struggles, and now, the rift with Henry. For the first time in a long time, Jalen felt truly lost. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Elena. "How are you holding up? Want to talk?" Jalen hesitated before typing back. "Not great. I don't even know where to start." Her reply came almost instantly. "You don't have to figure it out alone. Let's meet tomorrow." The next day, Jalen met Elena at a small diner near her apartment. The smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee filled the air as they slid into a booth. Elena didn't press him to talk right away, instead letting him take his time as they ordered and sipped their drinks. Finally, Jalen broke the silence. "I messed up," he admitted, staring down at his coffee. "I let my pride get in the way, and now I've probably ruined everything with Henry." Elena set her mug down, her gaze steady. "Henry cares about you, Jalen. One argument isn't going to change that, but you need to figure out what's really bothering you before you talk to him." Jalen sighed. "It's just, everything feels like it's slipping through my fingers. The bakery, my family, even Henry. I thought if I could prove myself, if I could make everything perfect, it would all fall into place. But instead, I'm just falling apart." Elena reached across the table, her hand resting gently on his. "You don't have to be perfect, Jalen. No one expects that from you. What matters is that you keep trying, even when it's hard." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He thought of all the times he'd pushed himself to the brink, believing that success meant never faltering. But maybe Elena was right. Maybe it wasn't about being perfect. It was about perseverance. That evening, Jalen returned to Henry's bakery. The lights were still on, and through the window, he could see Henry cleaning the counters. Taking a deep breath, Jalen pushed the door open, the familiar chime echoing through the quiet space. Henry looked up, surprise flickering across his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jalen stepped forward, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I shouldn't have said what I did. I wasn't thinking clearly, and I let my frustration get the better of me." Henry set the towel down, his expression softening. "I've been stubborn too," he admitted. "I've been so focused on protecting what I built that I didn't consider how things might need to change. Maybe we both need to find a middle ground." Jalen nodded, relief washing over him. "I don't want to lose this, Henry. I don't want to lose you. You've been there for me through everything, and I don't take that for granted." Henry smiled faintly, the tension in the room easing. "You've come a long way, kid, and I'm proud of you, even when we don't see eye to eye." They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken understanding between them stronger than words. Then Henry clapped a hand on Jalen's shoulder. "Now, let's figure out how to move forward." Over the next few weeks, Jalen and Henry worked together to blend their ideas. They found a balance between the traditional recipes that had made Henry's bakery a success and the modern flavors Jalen wanted to introduce. It wasn't always easy, there were still disagreements and moments of tension, but they approached each challenge with a newfound respect for each other's perspectives. The collaboration breathed new life into both bakeries. Customers were drawn to the unique menu, and the buzz around their partnership brought in media attention. For the first time in months, Jalen felt a sense of stability, but more importantly, he felt a sense of belonging. One evening, as they closed up shop, Henry handed Jalen a small box. "Open it," he said with a grin. Inside was a sleek engraved plaque that read, "Gaines and Whitaker, a legacy of passion and perseverance." Jalen stared at the plaque, his throat tightening. "I don't know what to say." "Say you're ready to build something even better than before," Henry replied, "because this is just the beginning." Jalen smiled, the weight of the past months lifting. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. Together, they were unstoppable. The autumn air in Chicago carried a crispness that whispered of change, swirling leaves painting the city in hues of gold and crimson. A large banner hung over the entrance to the newly renovated bakery, now a centerpiece of the bustling neighborhood. The bold letters spelled out, "Celebrating 25 years, Gaines and Whitaker Bakery, a legacy of excellence." Inside, the bakery buzzed with energy. The aroma of freshly baked bread and sweet confections filled the space as customers, journalists, and well-wishers mingled. At the center of it all stood Jalen Gaines, now a man in his early 50s. His tailored suit and confident demeanor spoke of his success, but his warm smile and humble eyes revealed the same heart that had carried him through decades of trials. Jalen scanned the room, feeling a mixture of pride and gratitude. The bakery had become more than a business. It was a cornerstone of the community, a place where people gathered to celebrate milestones, to seek comfort, and to create memories. For Jalen, it was also a testament to perseverance, built on the foundation of love and support he had received along the way. As he greeted guests and posed for photographs, a familiar voice cut through the chatter. "Still hogging the spotlight, huh?" Jalen turned, his face breaking into a grin. Henry Whitaker stood at the edge of the room, leaning on a cane but radiating the same commanding presence he had 25 years ago. His white hair and lined face showed the passage of time, but his eyes sparkled with pride. "You're the one who insisted on the celebration," Jalen said, walking over to embrace his mentor. "I thought you wanted to keep things low-key." Henry chuckled. "Low-key doesn't suit you, kid. Never has." They laughed, the years between them melting away. As they talked, Henry's gaze swept over the crowd. "You've built something incredible here, Jalen. I hope you know that." Jalen nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you, Henry. You gave me my start. You believed in me when no one else did." Henry's hand rested on Jalen's shoulder. "You took that start and made it your own. That's what matters." Their conversation was interrupted by the clinking of a glass, drawing everyone's attention. Elena, now the bakery's head chef and one of Jalen's closest friends, stood near the counter. "If I could have everyone's attention," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd, "I'd like to invite Jalen to say a few words." Jalen stepped forward, the room falling silent. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "First, I want to thank all of you for being here today. This bakery wouldn't be what it is without the support of our community, our incredible team, and, of course, Henry Whitaker, who taught me everything I know." The crowd erupted in applause, Henry raising his cane in acknowledgement. Jalen waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "This place isn't just a bakery to me. It's a symbol of what's possible when you don't give up, when you believe in yourself and the people around you. It's a reminder that every challenge is an opportunity to grow, and every failure is a step towards success." The applause came again, louder this time, but Jalen's attention was drawn to a figure lingering at the back of the room. An older man in a well-tailored suit stood quietly, his expression unreadable. Something about him seemed familiar, but Jalen couldn't place it. As the applause faded, the man began making his way forward. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice steady but tinged with hesitation. "Mr. Gaines, may I have a moment?" The crowd parted, curious eyes following the stranger as he approached. Jalen tilted his head, studying the man. "Of course," he said, extending a hand. "And you are?" The man hesitated before shaking Jalen's hand. "My name is Charles Dawson. You don't know me, but I think you might remember my father." The name hit Jalen like a lightning bolt. His grip on the man's hand faltered, memories rushing back with startling clarity. The park bench, the trembling hands, the words, "God bless you," whispered in gratitude. "Your father," Jalen said slowly. "He was the man I met in the park all those years ago." Charles nodded, his expression softening. "He was. And what you did for him that day, it stayed with him for the rest of his life. He talked about it often, how a boy's simple act of kindness reminded him that there was still good in the world." Jalen's throat tightened, the weight of the moment settling over him. "How is he asked, though he already feared the answer. Charles sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "He passed away a few years ago. Alzheimer's took a toll on him, but he never forgot that day. Even when his memories started to fade, he held on to that moment." Jalen's chest ached, but there was also a strange sense of peace in knowing that his small gesture had made a lasting impact. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said sincerely. "Your father was a kind man." Charles smiled faintly. "He thought the same of you, and he would have been so proud to see what you've built." The room was silent, the weight of the exchange hanging in the air. Jalen glanced at Henry, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Turning back to Charles, Jalen said, "Thank you for sharing that with me. It means more than I can say." Charles hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I actually have something for you," he said, handing it to Jalen. "It's a letter my father wrote. He asked me to give it to you if I ever found you." Jalen stared at the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. The crowd around them seemed to fade away as he carefully opened it, the sound of the paper tearing almost deafening in the quiet room. He unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the familiar, shaky handwriting. Jalen's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter. The room seemed to blur around him, the curious murmurs of the crowd fading into a distant hum. All he could focus on was the shaky handwriting that immediately transported him back to the park bench. to the fragile man who had taken his lunch with a whispered blessing. The letter began simply, "To the boy who gave me hope." Jalen's breath hitched and he continued reading, his voice trembling as he read aloud so everyone in the bakery could hear. "You may not remember me, but I will never forget you. That day in the park, you gave me something I hadn't felt in years: dignity. In a world that often looked at me as nothing more than a burden, you saw me as a person. You saw my hunger, my need, and you gave without hesitation. It was such a small thing to you, but to me, it was everything." Jalen paused, his vision blurring with tears. He blinked quickly, willing himself to continue. "That simple act of kindness stayed with me long after that day. It reminded me that the world isn't all darkness, and because of you, I found the courage to reconnect with my son, Charles. You see, before that day, I was too ashamed of my condition to face him. I felt like I had nothing left to give, but you, a child I'd never met, showed me what it meant to give selflessly. You inspired me to find the strength I didn't know I had." The crowd was completely silent now, their faces reflecting the emotion in Jalen's voice. "I don't know where life has taken you, but I hope you know that you made a difference. You gave me a second chance with my family, and for that, I will always be grateful. May your kindness return to you tenfold. With gratitude, George Dawson." When Jalen finished reading, he lowered the letter, his hands still shaking. His heart felt full yet heavy, the weight of George's words sinking in. He looked up at Charles, whose eyes were also glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," Jalen said, his voice thick with emotion, "for bringing this to me, for sharing his story." Charles smiled faintly. "It's me who should thank you. That day changed everything for my father and for me. Because of you, I got my dad back." As the crowd processed what they had just heard, Henry stepped forward, his cane tapping softly against the bakery floor. He placed a steadying hand on Jalen's shoulder and addressed the room. "This letter is a reminder of something I've always believed," Henry said, his voice strong despite his years. "It doesn't take much to make a difference in someone's life. A kind word, a helping hand, or even a shared meal. It all matters. Jalen has built this bakery with that same spirit, and it's why we're here today, celebrating 25 years of not just great food, but great heart." The applause started slowly, then grew into a thunderous ovation. Jalen felt his chest tighten as he glanced around the room, seeing the faces of friends, family, and strangers alike who had become part of his journey. After the celebration wound down, Jalen sat with Henry and Charles in a quieter corner of the bakery. The crowd had dispersed, leaving behind the warm glow of the evening and the faint hum of conversation from a few lingering guests. "You know," Charles said, sipping his coffee, "my father always believed that everything happens for a reason. That day in the park, he used to say, was proof of that. I think he would have liked this place." Jalen smiled. "I'd like to think so too, and honestly, everything I've done here is because of moments like that. It's not just about the food, it's about what it represents." Henry chuckled, his eyes twinkling with pride. "I'd say you've done all right for yourself, kid. Better than all right." Jalen turned to Henry, his expression softening. "None of this would have happened without you. You took a chance on me when no one else did. You showed me what it means to believe in someone." Henry waved a hand dismissively, though his smile betrayed his emotions. "All I did was open a door. You're the one who walked through it." As the evening drew to a close, Jalen stood in the doorway of the bakery, watching as Henry and Charles walked down the street together. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of cinnamon and nutmeg from the bakery, a fitting reminder of how far he had come. He thought about the letter in his pocket, George's words echoing in his mind. "May your kindness return to you tenfold." It already had, in ways he never could have imagined. Jalen turned back toward the bakery, where Elena and a few staff members were tidying up. The sign above the door glowed softly in the evening light. Gaines and Whitaker, a legacy of passion and perseverance. And as Jalen stepped back inside, he knew with unwavering certainty that the legacy they had built was more than just a business. It was a testament to the power of kindness, resilience, and the belief that even the smallest actions could create ripples that changed the world. As Jalen stood in the warm glow of the bakery's lights, watching the final customers trickle out, he thought back to where it all began. That small act of kindness, the lunch he gave away so long ago, had started a ripple that carried him through challenges, failures, and triumphs. It wasn't just about bread or pastries, it was about the connections, the lives touched, and the hope built along the way. But this isn't just Jalen's story, it's a reminder of how even the smallest acts of compassion can echo in ways we can't begin to imagine. And now, it's your turn. As you reflect on Jalen's journey, think about the ripples you've sent out into the world. Have you ever made a choice, big or small, that you didn't realize would change someone's life? Maybe there's a moment you've witnessed that left you in awe of what kindness can do. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Which part of Jalen's story resonated with you the most? What moment reached your heart and stayed with you? Share your feelings in the comments below. Your story might just inspire someone else to start their own ripple of kindness. If you've been touched by this story, don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an inspiring story. Let's keep spreading love, hope, and kindness together. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.